For more on the scandal's impact on United Airlines brand and its business, I'm joined by Douglas Kidd. He's an executive director at the National Association of Airline Passengers. Douglas, we heard there this scandal so far hasn't done United much damage. All those results were all calculated before this scandal erupted. You represent passengers. It doesn't really get much worse for passengers, this kind of episode, does it?
Well, this is an example of how not to treat passengers. There was nothing really to be gained by calling the police in to remove the passenger, because there were other passengers on that plane who, for a couple of $100 more, would have been glad to give up their seats, and there would have been no story. And this is a classic example not just of poor customer service, but a lack of thought on the part of the ground crew that got degenerated into a contest of wills between them and the passenger.
Is that what you think it was? I was about to say United obviously felt they were within their rights and said initially they were within their rights to do this.
Well, there is such a thing called the contract of carriage, which every passenger agrees to when they buy a ticket. And the contract of carriage does have a number of provisions where it says that a passenger can be removed from the aircraft. But simply declining to give up your seat for money is not one of those conditions where they can remove you. Generally, the conditions where you can be removed is if it's a safety issue, if you're being...
if you're drunk and disorderly, for example.
Exactly. Or if, say, the government says, we need space. Nobody's going to argue with the government. Or even if you smell bad, you can be removed. But in a case like this where they need space, okay, they have to come to terms with the passengers that are there that they've already seated. And if they had really used a little bit of forethought, they would have dealt with this issue before the passengers were put on the plane.
We get bombarded with information all the time from airlines about what you can and can't do and regulations and so on. I have to say, I think I'm like many people that before this incident didn't really ever contemplate how an airline might be able to haul me off the flight. Shouldn't airlines be really, instead of putting this in the small print, telling you this kind of upfront as a possibility?
Generally, normal traveler won't have to be faced with this at any given time, because all the issues will be dealt with. If the flight is oversold, they'll deal with it at the gate. They won't wait till you're on the plane and then, gee, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? The only situations where normally this takes place is where you have someone whose conduct has gotten them in trouble. Now, I have to say this, is that right now the airlines overwork their flight attendants. They don't give them enough rest, and while the planes have gotten more full with passengers, they've actually cut back the number of people to serve them. So you have some overworked flight attendants, and their nerves and their patience can get frayed pretty easily. So if you antagonize a flight attendant, they can have you removed from the flight over the most trivial things. In one case, a woman was dragged off of a flight simply because she sat in the wrong seat, and they said, you can't sit there. So she sat in another seat that was the wrong seat. You can't sit there either. She went back to her own seat, and the next thing she knew, the police were coming onto the plane for her.
There's a bigger picture here as well, Douglas. In the US, typically many flights are overbooked. This sort of thing does happen, although this incident obviously turned this into an international story. Is it a case of, does the US airline industry need to just stop overbooking its flights, or is it much less straightforward than that?
Well, actually, it's relatively simple what they could do. Overbooking is a standard practice, and for good reason, because not everybody shows up at the airport on time. And so there are empty seats that fly off with no one in them. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing from the passenger's point of view, but from the airline's point of view, they want to make money. So they sell more seats than there are on the plane. But they could do something about this. All they have to do is say to the people who are buying the seats that aren't there, say, look, the flight is oversold. We think you have a pretty good chance of getting on this flight, but we're giving you a standby ticket, and you should know this before you push the button and buy that ticket, so that, yeah, you might get to the airport and might be oversold. You might not be able to get on the plane.
So ultimately, it's about communication, essentially.
Exactly. Put it up front. Let the people know that what your situation is, and then people can make their own decision.
We'll have to leave it there. Douglas Kidd, many thanks indeed for coming in to talk to us.